Hey guys, welcome back. This is Aaron. Today I'm here to rank the studio albums of Elton John from worst to best. First impressions though, of course the dude's been around forever. Lots of famous songs, very distinct voice in all its different phases. One of those artists where one of his songs is probably in the background of so many different moments throughout your life you don't even really think about them all. I've been a big fan for a long time. I've had a lot of his stuff on physical copies for quite a while. But I hadn't quite heard everything, so this was also educational for me. General impression, I think his discography varies and oscillates wildly in quality from album to album sometimes. So I don't even really think he had one hard set peak. A lot of people say early to mid 70s, but even within that period for me I like some albums better than others, So yeah, almost always interesting to listen to, but very oscillating in quality for me. Just one more thing before I get started ranking these, there will be some unpopular opinions within this video. So if you have it in your head what the consensus about his music should be, and you're all like this in my comments after watching this video,
make it stop, hate this! Make it stop, hate this!
just remember you've been forewarned, okay? Anyway, yeah, coming in last place for me is Made in England, 2 stars. There's kind of a bittersweet tone to the opener, window dressing like a 90s rock ballad a little bit with some guitars, but really it's just window dressing, it's not. The entire opening stretch of the album sadly doesn't get any better. What even are those lyrics on House? Elton musing on entry-level psychology while giving a tour of his mansion. The title track is thankfully a little bit more upbeat, but also kind of bland, not like his best past decades pop rock kind of stuff. Pain sounds okay, also give this album a little drive. But it still kind of has this over-earnest feel, whereas past pop rock decade stuff used to sound a little bit more effortless. He's starting to sing with a smaller range now, although Cold has some vocal power surprise towards its end. I like the intro to Belfast. Please has a nice sort of comforting sound to it. The music and lyrical content match up pretty nicely. Man, the song, is most like House in this way, but not quite as much. Has a slightly earnest vibe that's not quite preachy, but still kind of has that vibe about it. It's just so different from most of his past work in that way. If one couldn't understand why 90s Elton isn't everyone's thing, I think they should kind of take a pause maybe. I think veteran artists who kind of went a bit overboard sometimes with their production in the 80s, kind of overcorrected in the 90s with slightly bland stuff by comparison. There is kind of a consistency in a way to Elton's 90s work, but I don't really care about consistency that much if it bores me. Sorry. Coming up next is The Diving Board with 2 stars again. Oceans Away, a vocal and piano solo. It's pretty, I can't remember the last time he even did that. This is very standard 21st century Elton for quite a while after that though. I feel like every once in a while he put out an album that for a time kind of stopped trying to grow or do something any different and kind of was just an amalgamation of typical traits from the albums surrounding it. I feel like 1982's Jump Up was another one of those albums, and The Diving Board for me is definitely one for his 21st century kind of phase. There's a plainness about this album that's just, why would you listen to this album over so many better ones of his? I have this on CD and I remember trying to like it, but it just never really grew on me. I guess some songs like The Ballad of Blind Tom would work well as one-offs on some of his other albums, but as this album goes on, kind of the sparsity of a lot of the tracks makes this for quite a long listen, at least for me. Elton also has quite a limited vocal range by this point in his career, so the songs have to be extra good in some other way. There are no really major highlights or lowlights. I feel like everything kind of sits at a 5-6 out of 10 sort of level on this album. I guess I kind of like Take This Dirty Water and the Fever Waltz a little bit, but overall, yeah, I just feel like everything on this album, he kind of did it better at different points in the prior 21st century. Up next is his 1986 commercial disaster Leather Jackets, 2 stars for this one. I think whether one thinks this album is truly terrible or not, I think most would agree that a certain change was in order. I used to think this album was a little bit better than Ice on Fire because I find the songs a little bit catchier in a most basic sense. But I kind of had to confront that bias a little bit because, like, a nursery rhyme album is going to be catchier than most music out there. But does that mean it's artistically better? I think not. His voice actually sounds alright on this album despite his problems at the time. Don't Trust That Woman and Go It Alone are kind of similar musically to a lot of Ice and Fire. Very synthetic, but also very safe. Sounds like drum machines, but they're not really doing anything interesting. One could argue there's a slightly perverse sense of fun to them, especially Don't Trust That Woman, but the vibe of them is even tackier and more uncomfortable than a lot of what's on Ice on Fire. Hoop of Fire is kind of Dullsville, and Memory of Love is one of the most elevator sounding, boring, overwrought ballads I've ever heard in my life. It's really shocking while listening to those two to think that previously he brought out Nikita, and the year before that, the pretty awesome title track to the Breaking Hearts album. Speaking in terms of ballads, of course. That's what's kind of shocking about this particular fall on this album. It seemed to happen really fast. I guess that's what happens when your personal life is in turmoil, unfortunately. No matter what job you have, your work might suffer. Fortunately, there are a few worthy tracks on this album. I think if one has to play through this whole thing, Gypsy Heart has a decent amount of passion behind it. The tune is decent as well. Same goes for Slow Rivers. I wish the production on both songs was a little bit better like I do for most of the album, but the songs are decent. Angeline is kind of fun, still kind of a trashy vibe, but a little bit cooler and laid back than some of the other songs. The best song on this album is probably Paris. Still a lot of the same production issues, but it just kind of sounds like more was put into it. The lyrics have kind of a cool visual quality to them, and there's a nice sense of build. I Fall Apart lyrically could have been a peek into his personal life for some people a little bit, but I guess the song's so dull that nobody really noticed. Like I said, I think this is a generally catchier album than Ice on Fire, but I still had to rate it a half star below. Still, I'd like to point out here that this is 1986, he's been in his career a long time, and this is the first time chronologically that an album of his went below 2.5 stars for me, so that's pretty good. Coming up next is Ice on Fire, 2.5 stars. A weird sort of transition begins with this album. This is the first album in his career that you kind of hear nothing of the 70s guy. The arrangements of this album, to be fair, are a lot more restrained than a lot of veteran artists would have been by 1985, but on Open of This Town you still hear a lot of 80s excess right away. Previous album Breaking Hearts still had a lot of songs with a sense of relative timelessness to them, so a lot changed in 1 year. Cry to Heaven on track 2 turns very serious all of a sudden. I don't quite buy it. He's performing it with outward passion, but to me it kind of sounds like bombast. Nikita, it's kind of great if you don't have full context of his career. It's a catchy ballad for sure, quite heartfelt with a lot of longing to it. It also shows off his more baritone vocals really well, but he definitely has better ballads throughout his career, that's for sure. Even in times not too long ago, I would have put Nikita as one of his best 80s songs, but I think time and playing a lot of his other stuff has kind of dimmed its shine a little bit for me. I don't know, the arrangement is a little bit too lightweight for sure, even next to something like Little Genie. In general, this album embraces the sound of the 80s a lot more than he'd done to its point. Like I said, there's nothing left of his 70s acclaimed sound on this album, basically. Sadly though, he kind of does it in a little bit of a boring way. Like, there are drum machines on this album, but they sound like they're just trying to imitate live drums as much as possible, so they sound kind of pointless. I got a little bit more respect for this album through rating his 80s songs individually, that's in another video, but this has always been one of his least memorable albums for me. I just never really think about any of these songs, even if I can hear that they're not actively terrible. Nikita and Shoot Down the Moon are both pretty memorable ballads. The atmosphere on Shoot Down the Moon is very mysterious and cool, that's for sure. But overall, yeah, this album is kind of bang in the middle average. But at this point, 16 years into his major recording career, this is only his second album chronologically that I'd have put below a 3. Next up is Victim of Love, 2.5 stars. This is his disco album. It's produced by Pete Bellotte, who did a lot of Donna Summer stuff. Once you read that, he did Hot Stuff. Kind of makes sense. Sonically, you can tell even on this that he's a very talented disco producer. Clearly, this is not his best production work either, but still. Guys, I can tell right away that some people enjoy listening to this stuff, even though disco is not really what you go to Elton John for. Even though the opening Johnny Be Good cover is way too long, I have to admit, guys, I'm not getting the vibe of a career worst album here. I'm really not. A couple of the 80s albums are worse. There's some good bass work across this album, some good general groove and punch. Elton's still in pretty good voice, but unfortunately sometimes the sum of these things don't end up greater than the parts. Unfortunately, I wish I could say I thought Victim of Love was some underrated thing, but I can't. One major problem with the album rears its head immediately on track 2. The incessant repetition of Warm Love in a Cold World on the chorus is a frustrating blunder because you can hear that if a little bit more work had been put into it, could have been a really good song. It feels kind of like nobody believed in the song quite enough to work on more than a couple of melodic ideas for it. The instrumentals run together on this album quite a fair bit, so sometimes it's really only the choruses determining a little bit of worth for the songs. Born Bad is another song with an undercooked chorus, but that one's more just there than the slight annoyingness of Warm Love in a Cold World. I feel like on Street Boogie, the basic chorus style finally comes together a little bit. That's probably the best song on here, along with, I guess, Thunder in the Night. This album for me is basically just more frustrating than bad. A lot of the songs are quite close to delivering some good hooks. Yeah, they were just not quite worked on enough, I don't think. Of course I get why Elton fans hate this, but for me this is just kind of an undercooked disco album. Even kind of trying to listen to it without the lens of Elton John fandom, yeah, this isn't too great. Coming up next, Peachtree Road, 3 stars. Weight of the World, I like the harmonies and the nice contented sound of it. I like that it's a ballad but not trying to be a big emotional thing. It's just kind of nice and comforting. I quite like the country-ish feel to a lot of this album as well, and the lush kind of instrumental setup of this. It's nice. But then as it kind of goes on, it becomes as ballad heavy as The Big Picture or any post-80s album of his really. Some of them, like I Stop and I Breathe, are kind of dull unfortunately. Answer in the Sky is a little bit over earnest. I wouldn't have called that a great singles choice. At this point of his career vocally, he can make new songs and still sound very distinct, of course, but his voice also sounds quite ragged whenever he tries to go for any higher note. He also kind of struggles to sing his old songs live at this point, unfortunately, although that's nothing to do exactly with this album. I like the idea musically to parts of this album, but to be real, he has such a large catalogue that almost nothing on here is going to be some huge standout, to be honest. The similar tempo runs together after a while, and there's absolutely no smoothness in his singing by 2004, if we're being honest. Finishing on a positive note though, Freaks in Love is quite a cute song for me, to be honest, and All That I'm Allowed is a really uplifting song of his in my opinion, probably his most for me since Healing Hands. I probably don't listen to that song enough, to be honest. I'm not sure exactly what differentiates it so much from his later earnest kinds of ballads, but I don't know, I just found that song quite heartwarming. Coming up next I have The One at 3 stars. Despite the purposeful tone of the previous album Sleeping with the Past, The One is his first true post-rehab project. First of the 90s, another one that feels very transitional. The Simple Life, okay. Durban Deep, this is not. Unlike that song, there's no sort of odd surprise style with this one. It's very early 90s adult pop. Very upbeat with that drum machine though. I guess that said, that song might have been a little bit more of a moment back then when the sound was a bit newer, but knowing what we know now, of course, songs like that were all over the radio back then. Simple Life and Sweat It Out at track 3 though, I feel like there's a slight funk influence which does admittedly kind of break new ground for him sonically, even though I'm not a huge fan of the results necessarily. This album is kind of split into 2 camps for me. The first one is kind of an upbeat anthemic pop, although very much of its time. One of those songs, Runaway Train though, has a nice kind of drive to it. I feel like that one actually could have fit quite well on Sleeping with the Past. The other camp is of course the earnest ballads. Elton's vocal state sounds very much carried over from the 80s at this stage, so it's still pretty strong, although there are times his voice is mixed quite low here, so maybe there truly was a little bit more strain starting to come into his higher notes than there was before. Just tonally though, still very much analogous to his past self at that point. The title track on track 2, that's quite a cool ballad, just as adult contemporary as most of the ballads on this album, but somehow a better version of it. I feel like the muted yet heavy snare gives the song a little bit more oomph. Emily's also quite a decent tune on here. Coming up next, The Big Picture, 3 stars. I kind of like the lush ambience to the opening track. Promises to be quite a different feel from Made in England already if that were to continue. I kind of like the pretty acoustic plucking showing up on the first couple of tracks. Pretty soon it's clear that this album is aiming to be unobtrusive background music, a ton of reverb on everything. This ambient approach, combined with a little bit more guitar on the end will come, makes it for a slight anthem, just slight, but around the time of If the River Can Bend, this ballad-only approach to this album is starting to become just a little bit much. A lot of the songs on this album would be pretty nice on their own, but putting them all together on one album, yeah. Although in a way I also like the kind of shamelessness of that move. Something About the Way You Look Tonight is a 90s ballad anthem though. It's weird to think that with its association with Candle in the Wind 97 with Princess Diana's death, it's one of the biggest selling singles of all time. But yeah, I really do think that's a good song. Verse, chorus, everything's good. Finally, the title track, following the big ballad single, has a little bit more drive to the sound. Recover Your Soul, probably his best vocal performance post-80s. He actually goes for some higher notes in this song that end up being pleasant to the ear. It's an otherwise typical song on this album, but the vocal kind of elevates it a little bit. Overall, I find this album pretty pleasant. It's an improvement over Made in England for sure, even if the approach to this album is kind of the same as the approach to that album, just tweaked a little bit. Coming up next, Songs from the West Coast, 3 star. This album already sounds more organic than his 90s stuff. The piano sound really goes back to the 70s, although I think I'd be able to recognise it as 2000s. It has kind of gentle, easygoing hooks across the first few tracks, but not a lot of urgency, so it's hard to imagine that they'd stand out hugely among his whole catalogue. I talk about one album or another being the one that started as vocal deepening, but on this one, he's still tonally very much intact, at least in his lower to middle register. Original Sin is really nice. I have this album on CD as well, but hadn't re-listened to it in years. I quite like the unabashed use of some drum machines like on Birds. They actually kind of function unmistakably as drum machines and aren't just there to imitate live drums like, for instance, a lot of his 80s work. I Want Love is a little bland for me, but I also kind of respect that it sounds unmistakably modern for an Elton single. It's cool he was still trying to bring something different considering how late in his career he was. The Wasteland is one of the coolest things he'd put out since 1989. The production on it's a little bland, unfortunately, like a lot of his post-80s work would end up being, but it's still a cool song. Blues rock, I'd guess you'd call it. Very American South inspired. Love Her Like Me, interesting burning lyric for Elton to take on. I like that he was thinking outside the box a little bit with that one. Next up I have Reg Strikes Back at 3 stars. Open a Town of Plenty here, very 80s of course, but a little bit more of a sense of purpose to the song I feel than his last couple of album openers at least. At this point, 1988, he's recently had his vocal operation and wisely sat out 1987 for bringing out new material. I think his voice on this album sounds very clean and restored. I really don't hear any tonal difference from the prior decade pre-surgery in my opinion. So yeah, I dig the sound of his voice on this album despite not liking all the songs. A Word in Spanish is a pretty nice little song. He sounds more invested in it as a ballad than most of Leather Jacket's ballads, to be sure. He also doesn't overextend the emotion of it, which is nice. But I don't think most of the singles on here were quite good enough to make up for the 80s tackiness that remains on some of the tracks. A lot of this stuff, much like Leather Jackets or Ice on Fire, doesn't sound much connection to the Elton of the 70s that we've grown up with. Well, not me, but people back then. That's why I don't really consider this album a great comeback like it was advertised as being. It kind of puts things on an even keel again, but I don't think on its own it's especially noteworthy. Yeah, there's a lot of tacky production like on Mona Lisa's Part 2, or just kind of plain tunes like Poor Cow. I don't want to go on with You Like That as a kind of corny but still kind of cool pop song though. There's something kind of cool about it somehow, even though it's overall not. Elsewhere, Japanese Hands, kind of minimalistic. It's not that great on its own, but I kind of do appreciate the hints of experimentation. Goodbye Marlon Brando also brings back some nice power pop, really good guitar riff to that one. Actually kind of better than some of his other stuff in that vein from this decade. Up next, Blue Moves, 3 stars. At this point of the 70s, I feel like things were tracking pretty well. Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy was good. Not my absolute favourite, but it was good. Rock of the Westies was an album I really enjoyed. Rankings of both of them still to come. And this was promising to be a grand, ambitious type of album. So this kind of started out with a distinct feel on side A, which to me showed initial promise. Early on with this album, it's consistent. It's melancholic, but also dramatic. I could have imagined myself at the start giving it a good technical score right away, but immediately it doesn't begin quite as the inviting listen that Rock of the Westies was going to be. The opening instrumental and Tonight. I have to admit the sound of Tonight is pretty grand, but it's also kind of dramatic and soapy. You could say it's kind of the more ballad-oriented cousin to Funeral for a Friend. One Horse Town, the symphonic dramatic pop rock continues in a more upbeat number. But it kind of morphs into a pretty typical Elton 70s album after the distinct start it had, only with songs that are way longer than they need to be. Apart from the length of the songs, it's kind of difficult at times to find specific things to complain about, because even despite the melancholic, dramatic, slightly symphonic flavour to some of it, a lot of it's still kind of pretty standard Elton 70s music. Boogie Pilgrim definitely sounds influenced by me by some of the more whimsical stuff on, say, Beatles' White Album, but the song's way longer than it needs to be, simply put. I kind of have to admit, objectively speaking, there is some diversity on here. Towards the end, the jazzy song Idol, that was the most jazz-oriented thing he'd done to date. Between 17 and 20 also has kind of folkish influence, with also some sitar use and weird synths, which is definitely unusual for him around the time. Or any time, really. I mean, Sorry seems to be the hardest word as a pretty memorable single, and actually pretty good representation of this album's sound. especially the start of the album. Overall, yeah, I think this was probably his weakest album to its point. He hadn't figured out how to make a truly bad album yet, but Goodbye Yellow Brick Road in terms of double Elton John albums, this is not. This is technically not horrible, but nothing I'd probably ever feel like listening to again. Coming up next, I have the lost debut Regimental Sergeant Zippo, 3 stars. When I Was TLB Abbey is such a cool opener. It's really crazy to get this chronologically as his most recent album because his voice on it sounds so young. It's crazy to think how slowly but unmistakably it changed over time. This album was made 50 years before Wonderful Crazy Night. I guess it's no wonder. First 2 tracks are really good. Sitting Doing Nothing at track 3, not quite as much, but I still like the 60s-ness of it. Magical Mystery Tour and Sgt. Pepper's are my 2 favourite Beatles albums, and this album is very much inspired by stuff like that, I'd have to say. There's definitely that 60s psychedelic beauty to the sound of this album, but not a lot of songs I describe as beautiful as in like the emotional lyrics of them. Turn to Me could have been a decently successful single, I feel like. I don't know, something about this album is hard to take too seriously because of the strange circumstances in which it was released. Shelved for over 50 years, sounds nothing lyrically or musically or vocally even like the Elton of the current day. But I guess this is canonical considering it's been released to all physical, digital and streaming media. You'll Be Sorry to See Me Go has a straightforward lyric and I guess kind of a soul-influenced sound. I wouldn't say this is better than Empty Sky as his true debut, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some overlap in the sound of the 2 albums. Obviously destiny worked out and the correct debut was released, but this is a nice little detour though. Up next I've got Wonderful Crazy Night, 3 stars. Right away on the opening track, a much more promising T-Bone Burnett production for an Elton John track. It's upbeat, it's kind of fun. It couldn't establish a different mood from The Diving Board already if it tried. In the Name of You is a really good pop number. I can't lie, this album at its beginning is reminding me of some of his better 80s stuff in particular, kind of the more light pop rock side of him. Clawhammer goes to his more familiar 21st century mode immediately, but it's still quite a good song. Interesting to hear him try singing a bit more softly on Blue Wonderful at its start. I didn't actually recognise his voice right away, I thought he might have been doing a duet. Then with a Good Heart right afterwards, 2 sweet songs in a row, nice. Overall, there's a nice kind of sense of positivity to this album. I'm not sure why I wasn't really looking forward to hearing this one. I mean, I guess I know why, because of the Diving Board, but still. Also, I guess the cover art kind of sucks. Guilty Pleasure brings back some of the old power pop style he'd pretty much abandoned. I approve this direction. I kind of had to ask myself though, is this really better than like a 3? Is it a proper very good album of his, or does it just sound better than a lot of say 90s stuff, or generally post-80s stuff by comparison? To give it a 3.5, it'd be kind of one I'd feel like returning to at some point, and maybe has a little bit of growing room even. I don't honestly think I probably need to hear this album again. I think it was just after The Diving Board I was relieved to get something a little bit more lively. This is a good album and I see why some would be tempted to put it in that above 3 range. I'm just trying to be realistic about my chances of needing to hear it again, and I probably won't. Good album though. Next up, Jump Up at 3 stars. I think the title is kind of fitting here because I think this album kind of represents a slight jumping off point at the time. Right off the bat, Open Dear John should be hitting. It's got tempo, energy, it kind of rocks out, but I don't know, something about it kind of feels like it's on autopilot. I think kind of the tune sounds like it's taking the easy way out every time. It's listenable of course, but yeah, it's nothing crazy. Maybe I could put that one down to a me problem. I'm sure a lot of other people really like that song. If anything, I actually think Elton's ability to write catchy, memorable vocal hooks improved in his career, but sometimes, yeah, they sounded a little bit like they were too easy, if that makes sense, at least on a lot of the album tracks. I do kind of like track 2, Spiteful Child, for its own sake, but in the full context of his career, is it a rock song? Is it a pop song? I don't know. It kind of sounds like it was trying to be an 80s pop rock song, but kind of in the safest way possible, if that makes sense. Ball and Chain and Legal Boys sound a lot more 70s, but I don't know if I'd call either of them highlights in the context of his 70s career. But again, that might be a me thing. I could hear how some old fans might be fans of Legal Boys especially, but yeah, something about this album for me, it's just kind of lacking in purpose a little bit. I mean, let's think about what was leading up to this one. Victim of Love was a failed disco experiment, but you could say he was trying something different. 21 at 33, he was really trying to prove himself again and get back on track. The Fox has his first stabs at synth pop as well as a full-on classical piece, so it was still trying to break new ground at times leading up to this album. This album to me kind of sounds alright superficially, but it sounds a little bit also like it's kind of his product for the year. This album does show some true spark around its middle though, with Blue Eyes and Empty Garden. Both really distinct ballads from each other and also really good vocals on both in different ways. But Empty Garden in particular, despite the great vocal tune, inspiration, passion, etc., the arrangement of it has kind of dated horribly. I can tell why it's a fan favourite, but I can also kind of hear why some would dislike it musically. I'm kind of in the middle on it these days. It's clear on this album he hasn't lost his songwriting gifts entirely, and his voice is still in pretty great shape at this point as well. But it's kind of the first warning sign for me that if he wanted to, he could kind of start churning albums out on autopilot. Not to belabor the point too much, but all his other albums before this one to me sound like they're kind of a part of an evolution or kind of relate in some way to the album that came before it. Jump Up is the first kind of point in his career where I think this is kind of just a generic Elton John album. I will finish on a compliment though. I also think Where Have All the Good Times Gone is quite a cool song. Up next, this is where the unpopular opinion warning comes in. Tumbleweed Connection, 3 stars for me. This album starts out alright. I have to admit, re-listening to it, I didn't remember a thing about it from before. I kind of finally have a firm thought as to why this album kind of has trouble sticking in my memory banks. Besides the obvious answer that they just weren't really going for catchy singles with this album. I kind of think why my mind kind of puts this aside compared to some of his other works even from during this kind of same time period, is that he always tended to play piano in a similar style anyway, but even with the kind of country and western musical style on here doing something a little bit different, his playing on a lot of his other work around this time tended to be similar, but the songs tended to be catchier, so that's kind of why I'd go for other albums around this time period. The songs were just catchier for the most part. I mean, not always. More on those albums soon enough. There's some superficial difference in that country style instrumentation kind of pops up here and there, but overall the production style and rhythm section etc. is kind of exactly the same as his other work around this time period. My Father's Gun kind of gets close to sounding a little bit distinct with that earthy, more acoustic guitar driven arrangement, but then eventually all the other instruments come in and it's kind of a typical Elton 70s song again. That said, what is good on here? Country Comforts probably should have been a single. Befitting its title, there is a certain sense of comfort about it. Love Song is also kind of one of the better songs on here for the aesthetic the album's going for because it's centered around acoustic guitar picking and puts the piano away. That's kind of the long and short of it. A few more songs with that kind of aesthetic and this could have been a more distinct album among Elton's catalogue, although I recognise they were probably not actually trying to reinvent Elton's early style too much. I feel like I'm babbling a little bit here, but I think the simple truth is that I'm just not a great fan of this album. I don't think there are a lot of really memorable instrumental or piano parts in general, and it kind of just makes me long to listen to more catchy stuff of his. That's kind of the shortened story with this album and me. There's too much going on here for less than 3 stars. I mean, the sheer ambitious scale to the closing track Burn Down the Mission, for instance, but still it's a pretty unenthused 3 stars for me. Next up, 3 stars, the debut Empty Sky. First off, that's a really cool cover art. I feel like nowadays that would be pretty easy to do with a filter, but back then it looked like someone actually painted that, which is cool. The opening track has some really cool individual sounds. It's really fascinating across this whole album in general to hear his voice not terribly different than later, but just more clear and youthful. The drum sound is great, as is the piano sound. It's also quite cool to hear some late 60s stylings like woodwind, but ultimately the song kind of starts with intrigue and loses it a little bit. Keep in mind, Bernie's not really starting off his lyrical career with love song type stuff, but kind of more whimsical or artful kind of themes. I wouldn't say it's a soul-crushingly long 8.5 minutes, but I'm still ready for the next song eventually. Valhalla is better immediately for me. It's about a heavenly realm, and something about the arrangement and the reverb-heavy vocal really gets that across for me quite well. On an album with so little prioritizing of emotive content overall, there's a really nice kind of warmth to that song. Overall, it's kind of crazy to think he'd grow into such an effective performer of emotive ballads listening to a lot of this. He establishes some sonic hallmarks like on Hymn 2000, and there's a nice rock foundation to a lot of the tracks that it definitely build on. But the extremely flowery lyrics on here kind of cap the potential for emotive quality, which is really one of the main reasons I think people listen to Elton John. Maybe fans of his voice or composition style, but not all his usual styles of music, could actually find this to be one of his better albums. That wouldn't surprise me, so for that reason I couldn't go lower than 3. It is unique in his catalogue. For early hints of some vocal genius, The End of Sales shows a lot of vocal control. Skyline Pigeon, I can't lie, even though I prefer the piano version from a couple of years later, feels like really that song kind of set the blueprint most of this album for his future work. It's a shame that It's Me That You Need wasn't on this original album, because I think it's one of the best very early Elton songs that kind of shows what his genius would be for me.
Coming up next is A Single Man, 3 stars. This album I feel kind of is one of those that starts a new era for him, his first without Bernie. A song like Big Dipper does sound like the kind of lyrics Bernie would write, but besides that, just the approach to this album, the feel to it, kind of the safeness of it. Before that, the opener Shine On Through, I feel like that's one of those songs that points the way towards his 90s ballads maybe. Very safe, very adult contemporary. Not bad for an opener, but not hugely exciting. I normally associate this adult contemporary Elton with his later deeper voice though, so it's interesting to hear his still original kind of youthful voice on it. Who knew after a first decade with such a stable youthful tone in his voice that it would change so much later on? It's not just all adult contemporary though. It Ain't Gonna Be Easy reminds me of his earlier stuff again. It's kind of weird to think in 1978 he'd already been around long enough that there's kind of a break between early and later. The tropical overtones on Return to Paradise kind of remind one of his earlier effortless experimentation, although the song itself is very safe. There are a few quite good moments more on the second half. Part-Time Love injects a little bit of lightheartedness into the album. That was a single, it should have been a hit, but something tells me listening to it that it might not have been that much of one. I didn't look up the chart position of it. George's kind of country and gospel influence crept up on me a little bit. At the beginning, I didn't think the song would be all that interesting, but it ended up delivering. And Song for Guy is quite cool, almost kind of a magical atmosphere to it. Cool, but overall I'm not quite sure Elton pulls this off for me. I can't lie, I find it a little bit corny. I don't think it really meshes with his overall image at all. To be fair, I do like parts of the song and I think it has a good ending especially. For me, track 3 Grimsby is the first real winner of the album. Really catchy, good tune. So the album does get off to a fine but imperfect start. Overall, this album, I feel like the idea for an album like this could have come from after the epic scope of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road to make something a little bit less of a statement, just a little bit more fun. But some songs like Dixie Lily or Solar Prestige, they have kind of a cartoonish quality to them to me. Solar Prestige is pure novelty song, obviously, but even Dixie Lily, which is a little bit more of a song, I feel like has that quality to it as well. Some strengths of the prior couple of albums do remain though. I've Seen the Sources is on a better track for me than some of the other songs on the album. The trade-off is that the hooks aren't quite as strong or as silly as some of the others, but it's good for me. Track 2, Pinky, kind of like The Bitch Is Back. I like parts of it, but not totally convinced by the whole thing. I'd be kind of alright putting this at 3.5, but it kind of goes down to 3 for me because the big emotional centerpiece on the album is a song that's just never been a huge favourite of mine. Don't Let the Sun, I can't say that this doesn't have some of his most memorable piano work, and I do kind of like the slightly more modest quality to the studio version compared to the live versions, which tended to go for overblown every time. I don't really love the song overall though. I feel like it kind of just goes on forever basically. So yeah, this album's fine, but I don't quite consider it as up to the standard of his previous two. A little bit more superficial by comparison.
Next, 3.5 stars for The Captain and the Kid. Postcards from Richard Nixon is a nice sprightly opener, a good rhythmic focus on the piano, just like Noah's Ark is an even more upbeat country rock type of thing. Right away on this album I can hear a little bit more production polish, maybe just like 5 to 10% difference, but it's enough to differentiate it a little bit from his other 21st century albums that came before it. What If, Hear Me Out. At the time this came out, it was even more needed than the original Captain Fantastic. The original Captain Fantastic had a cinematic feel, sure, but at the time he'd also released a lot of albums before it that had a kind of cinematic feel to it as well. In 2006, he hadn't brought out anything with this particular feel in quite a long time. Maybe not even since the 80s, to be honest. That instrumental middle 8 and Wouldn't Have You Any Other Way, really cool. Tinderbox, also a really effortless single. Kind of mid-range for Elton single-wise, but I still hear why it was chosen. I really like the bridge on that song. I'm basically just going chronological in this review so far, but that's because I'm impressed. I think this is a vast improvement on most of his 90s and later stuff. And The House Fell Down, nice energy to it. I think his vocals on this album even sound better than a lot of his other stuff around the time. A little bit more of a retained sense of smoothness. Maybe he was recording more takes, or maybe his voice is turned down in the mix a little bit, although not very much I'd say, because his vocals are still very much at the forefront. I Must Have Lost It on the Wind is probably my favourite off this album, very nostalgic in tone. It's nice. Lowest 3.5 possible, but I think this is that 2000s album.
Alright, for me we're up to 3.5 stars for Breaking Hearts. This one had big shoes to fill after the previous album, Too Low for Zero, for me. So Open and Restless is kind of lightweight musically for me, but the tune and the lyrics are pretty cool for me. Bernie going a little bit more socially conscious is not a detour he'd often take. Track 2, Slow Down Georgie, kind of confirms that Elton's trying generally to hang on to general vitality. I actually think that song's a pretty damn good pop rock number though. It's really catchy. In general, I think this album's sound is pretty good. It's pretty restrained in terms of its 80s production even, except for a couple of the tracks. Overall, there's kind of a sense of professionalism rather than massive excitement permeating this overall album. I feel like most of the songs sit at a comfortable kind of 7 out of 10 level. None of his absolute best or worst tracks are on this album, but if Too Low for Zero proved that Elton could be kind of different and exciting on occasion, Breaking Hearts feels just a tiny bit more business as usual by comparison. That said, I do think this is a better album than Jump Up. Slow Down Georgie, again, really good pop rock number. The title track has a really cool late night lonely feel that a lot of his ballads don't have. It feels like it could have been an early Tom Waits cover or something. As good as those two songs are though, thankfully they have an even better pair for two songs elsewhere on the album. Lil Refrigerator brings back that fun, slightly goofy feel off some of Too Low for Zero's upbeat numbers. It's definitely power pop rather than rock, but it still rocks out pretty good, really easy to bang your head to. And I think that In Neon is one of Elton's most underrated 80s songs. It's sad, but also kind of has an understated mid-tempo quality, which I think is really effective. I guess Passengers is kind of goofy as well, but not really in the best way for me. Despite the presence of In Neon and the big single sad song Say So Much, with that song on the second half, it kind of starts to fall apart a little bit for me. Burning Buildings and Diddy Shooter are both kind of 80s excess for me, although not in too bad a way. But to close on a positive note, Side A is pretty much solid all the way through, and there are 4 hidden gems plus a big single on this album, so I think this deserves 3.5 stars, but only. Another unpopular probably opinion coming, Madman Across the Water up next, 3.5 stars. Continues the basic sound of the Friends soundtrack before it, with the piano and orchestra really up front on equal footing. I have to admit, even though I kind of mentally lump together his early albums together sometimes, all 4 previous albums had been quite different from each other. Tiny Dancer, can't complain. I don't play it quite as much as some of his other early singles, but yeah, it's good. Those humming vocals at the end of it are honestly the perfect touch. This album for me, technically there are some interesting arrangements like Holiday Inn has some nice acoustic stuff as well, and some adventurous vocals like Levon, but I also kind of remember why I never really go back to this one. During this time period in general and on this album, Elton's not really bringing his best hooks just yet. A lot of the lyrics are also still leaning very flowery and esoteric at this stage, which I admit isn't quite my taste. The piano playing's always good of course, but I think there's a reason why Tiny Dancer survived longest in his setlist. The piano part from the start of that song is really the one from this album that everybody remembers. If you really like an Elton album that's really well orchestrated but kind of prioritizes consistency over a few knockout punches, then Madman is the one for you. Yeah, for me, just not quite enough variety yet, especially in the piano playing. All the Nasties in general as a song sounds quite a bit like Tiny Dancer, even in the piano playing. His best albums for me are songs where everyone's good, but one doesn't necessarily sound like another one on the album. The additional drum reverb in some parts of All the Nasties, which kind of predicts the 80s sound a little bit, it's interesting to me though. There are certain forward steps he does take on this album though. Levon is probably the most ambitious vocal performance he'd done to date, for another notable moment on the album for track 2. There's also a slight hint of mood variety here and there. What I like Breaking Down Barriers is one I underestimated in the past a little bit. It does kind of have a triumphant sound about it, befitting such a title and its lyrics. Has a good energy to it as the opener. There is a little bit more reverb, a little bit more of an 80s sound starting to creep in, but it still feels pretty in line with what had come before. There's definitely a slight shift in style for some of the album though. Heart in the Right Place on track 2 is a pretty cool kind of bluesy rock number with a bit of a spacey feel to it with the vocoder, and a pretty cool synth choir effect to it as well. So you can hear him at the beginning of the 80s here, starting to introduce some of the hallmarks of the decade's sound in a pretty tasteful way at this stage. I feel like the song's more notable production-wise than anything on its composition, but it's still got a sense of cool about it. The next 3 tracks, and even that one a little bit to be honest for me, not fully delivering. Nobody Wins as his first stab at full-on synth pop was quite a cool experiment for him to do that, but I feel like it was kind of a superficial stab at it rather than a truly great example of the genre. But then suddenly a switch kind of flips, and I feel like side B, or the second half of this album, is one of the best album sides he ever put together. You get the really nice pop orchestra Carla etude to open, and then you get the slightly foreboding sound of Fanfare, which I think is a slightly better stab at synth pop than Nobody Wins on this album, even though it's an instrumental. And then the haunting ballad Chloe after that, very light in sound but in a good way. It really builds atmosphere quite nicely. The closing title track is kind of a return to his exact 70s sound pretty much, maybe one of the last times he'd ever sound that 70s again with his slowly evolving singing style as well. What puts side B most over the top for me is Elton's song. My Elton 80s song ranking video would clue one in, but unless something from the 90s or later dethrones it, which I hadn't heard, Elton's song is my favourite Elton song of the 80s and, to be honest, of all time. It's really beautiful, vulnerable, shy, sweet, all that stuff. The melody and vocal is perfection. I think it's better than Candle in the Wind even, and a lot of other more famous ballads of his. 10 out of 5 stars for that one. So yeah, in the end, 3.5 for the Fox, just for the slightly less than ideal side A, but his career best songs on this album at least. So yeah, up next I've got Captain Fantastic at 3.5 stars. This feels like an album an Elton fan is really supposed to like. There are only a few like that in his discography, I think, really, but this feels to me like it's one of them. But I'm not crazy about it. I give it a 3.5. I like it better than Tumbleweed, for instance, but I feel like that's slightly more of a technical score than anything else. I can't fold it much on anything concrete except to say that the songs just aren't that catchy for me, but this album does have strengths to it as well. But first, a busier than usual cover art, but one of his best album covers for me. It's great. And to be fair, this album does manage to break more new sonic ground for him than I remember. It's crazy how much funkier by normal comparison Tell Me When the Whistle Blows is, although typically for this album, not really one of his best hooks. Jumping back, I like the almost cinematic folk rock kind of feel to the opener. Kind of overall suggests a more sprawling or ambitious project rather than like a pop album as such. Matches the cover art perfectly. The best stretch for me comes on the second half of the album. Better Off Dead has a really cool bounce to it, probably my favourite song off this album. Writing has a wistful-ish tune, and We All Fall in Love Sometimes almost rises to the level of some of his past more catchy ballads. I don't really have a ton else to say about this one. I think the production on it's really great, and I kind of feel the cinematic sort of feel that the album's going for. I just don't find many of the songs really memorable, either as standalone listens or sufficiently to return to the album a lot as a whole. There's really only so high I can go with the rating. Up next is Honky Chateau, 3.5 stars. Honky Cat is by far his best quote-unquote pop song of the early years, like pre-73. It's fun and bouncy, the lyrical meaning is coherent, which wasn't always the case with the early stuff. It's just overall really memorable. Mellow is a nice ballad for me, not especially memorable, but sounds good while it's on. Those more a fan of Elton's era where his ballads did have a little bit more of a sense of casualness about them would probably love it a bit more. Personally, at this point chronologically in my listening, I was ready for Elton's sound to evolve just a little bit. Despite a pretty strong single with Honky Cat, this is pretty much his third album in a row with the same instrumental palette, production and vocal piano style and basically everything. Fourth really, because I don't really consider Tumbleweed that different except superficially. This makes the 4 albums following the self-titled a slight step down for me. Elton John the album very much sounds like him of course, but still has a slightly different sound to it for me. Of course, Rocket Man rounds out side A, and there's a reason why that's considered a classic, I think. It's not a huge personal favourite of mine, but you can't say it's not memorable. Side B starts out with Salvation, quite a soulful semi-ballad, and Slave with its more acoustic and banjo focus does point the way towards more musical diversity, which I have to admit I complain sometimes is missing a little bit from Elton's early work. Amy next up kind of goes right back to being a pretty typical 70s Elton song though. Mona Lisa's and Mad Hatters, I know this is pointed at as a classic early Elton song, but it's kind of emblematic of why Elton's early period isn't always necessarily my favourite. It sounds a ton like Border Song off the self-titled. Like I said, some good songs on this album, but I'm really just ready for his next phase. Although to be fair, there are points it has a cool almost French influence to it. I half expect to hear an accordion pop up at some point. Hercules closes this off well, quite a cool rock and roller. I kind of hear him at times on this album trying to expand his boundaries a little bit, but to me a lot of it just does still feel stuck in his early mode a little bit. A lot of fans and critics love that exact early style from him, to be fair.
Next, 3.5, Elton John, the album. With this one, I have to start off by saying I'm not a huge fan of the early 70s coffee shop singer-songwriter kind of aesthetic. The first two tracks aren't quite that with the lush strings all over them, but take those out and I think the studio version of Your Song would be pretty dull for me. Unpopular opinion. It doesn't present as a bad starting point for kind of his major recording career, but I think it would be pretty quickly overshadowed by other stuff he'd release. It's wild after Empty Sky to get basically 2 love songs in a row, but I think the lyrics are a little bit awkward in parts of both of them. Take Me to the Pilot adds some energy though and takes us firmly out of the coffee shop. And No Shoestrings on Louise continues this as well, some nice slide guitar on that song. I don't really know what either song is supposed to be about, which is another little nitpick I have with this album. Elton's voice is centered so much in the sound of this album, but what he's singing is kind of drivel a lot of the time. The good news is Bernie would become a lot better at, dare I say, making his lyrics a lot more relatable. First episode and 60 years on, credit for keeping a similar approach but making the approach a little bit more baroque and almost regal sounding instead of coffee shop-esque. 60 years on strings have an almost horror score-esque quality to them, which is very interesting. Much later on in his career with Shoot Down the Moon, he'd kind of explore kind of a similar atmosphere like that again, but not in the exact same way that he does here on 60 Years On. I also have to give credit that there's always a lot more diversity on here than I remember. There are just enough songs like Your Song, I Need You to Turn To, and The Greatest Discovery, and I feel like Elton gets to do a bit more vocally on the second half of the album. All of this is enough for me to give it a pretty easy 3.5, even if individual aspects of it here and there are not quite my personal taste as much. It manages to rock out here and there even, establishing Elton pretty early on as equal parts low and up tempo. A very important album in his development, obviously. Coming up next, up to 4 stars for 21 at 33. First album of the 80s, and for me it's a very good one. Opener Chasing the Crown, surprisingly punchy. Really awesome backing vocals on that as well. One thing I really like about this album, which I never really see talked about, is how punchy the low end generally is. The drums, bass, and even the piano as well kind of adds a lot more power to the sound and by extension makes it a little bit more catchy. Probably the most for me since Rock of the Westies, which was 5 years earlier than this album at that point. I also think this is the first album that starts to show off the lower end of his singing voice just a little bit more. Not a complete shift like later, but just a little bit. It's quite clear that this is a course corrective album after Victim of Love, because this continues very much where A Single Man left off. This album, like that one, kind of dispensed with some of the harder rocking or more cinematic qualities of his work that had come before. This is another purely soft rock album basically. Upbeat, downbeat, whatever, tempo, it's all soft rock or adult contemporary, whatever you want to call it. That kind of sounds like a criticism, but for me on this album that approach ends up working. The stronger low end of the album again gives the songs just enough punch. This is still very much in his 70s style musically, but I think unpopular opinion, the pop craft on here is better than a lot of his 70s albums. Little Genie is the most remembered hit off here, good reason. I think that's one of his most heartwarming songs maybe ever. Sartori or Eloquence, I could see how the synths on it could be a little bit too much for some people, but I think they add a good amount of emotion to the song. White Lady, White Powder is one of his most underrated singles for me. I actually think it's a blast. It's got a nice tempo, it's pretty sly lyrically, the Eagles are on backing vocals, yeah, always liked it. 2 Rooms at the End of the World is a little repetitive, but not a bad listen. Never Gonna Fall in Love Again is a nice chilled ballad. By no means is this album perfect or seemingly one of his most essential works, but musically I really like it. I find 5 of the tracks on here pretty great, and the remaining ones listenable. I think this album deserves a low 4 stars as kind of a technical score. You can kind of hear the last gasps of him being an artist you could categorize as rock on this album, but I think this is still pretty solid adult pop rock. Coming up next at 4 stars, I have Sleeping with the Past. Yeah, I really like this album and I think I put it in his upper echelon. I think at times he replicates the feel of soul and his own Elton style really well on this album. Better for instance when he made an Elton country album with Tumbleweed. That's just me. I kind of prefer musically 21 at 33 ranking wise, but I feel like song wise this album's a little bit more cohesive, which is why I put it 1 space ahead. Durban Deep is so unique and cool in his discography. I don't know how that clunky reggae beat works, but it kinda does. The production's interesting, it's got a catchy tune, it's a really great opener for me. And then Healing Hands comes on. Man, that song's really uplifting for me, and I think it proves his vocal decline wouldn't come until later. He really sings the hell out of that song, matching the gospel choir-inspired vocals easily. Overall, not a perfect album because Stone's Throw from Hurden and the title track in the middle there are kind of a bit lightweight for me. I'm not really a huge fan of the synth guitar on the title track, but overall both tunes are fine and most of the others really land for me. Whispers is a very pleasant, even-handed ballad. As a standalone listen, it doesn't sound incredible as a song or anything, but when you think his ballads for the past 3 albums have been very hit or miss, one realizes just how solid that song really is. Some pretty haunting melodies in the song, really good. Club at the End of the Street is a simply happy and contented song. I feel like it'd be really hard to be in a bad mood while it's playing. Sacrifice, not my absolute favourite hit of his, a little bit too lightweight for me, but I'd also say it's his catchiest single since probably Nikita. Never Knew Her Name was a dark horse for one of his best songs of the 80s for me. A really nice retro soul styling to that one, but with the best possible 80s Elton sheen as well. Yeah, there are times this album's a little bit adult contemporary, but for me it's never less than pleasant, and at its best I think it has his most uplifting tunes since I'm Still Standing at that point. Coming up next, still at 4 stars, I have Too Low for Zero. I don't know where this album came from after Jump Up, but we still see Elton very much inspired, churning out some fine pop and pop rock craft despite some 80s coldness starting to creep into the production, which I couldn't help but notice. I just think this has some of his career best hooks though. One thing I mentioned in the Jump Up review was I think Elton's ability to hone in on really catchy vocal melodies had improved over time, even if some other aspects of his music had started to decline a little bit. Unlike what the biopic told us, Elton hadn't just gone through rehab when this album came out, and I'm Still Standing was just another hit of his at that time, although it was a heck of a single. Compare it to Dear John from Jump Up. The musical style is basically exactly the same, but for me the level of energy and inspiration in it is off the charts compared to Dear John. For me, the title track and Crystal are Elton's best to goes at co-opting the 80s sound. I like both songs a lot. There's a real catchy but still kind of slightly dark synth pop feel to them. Not completely, but just as a slight overtone. They're both cool songs anyway. Religion is a light pop rocker, but the lyrics are oddly compelling, kind of comedic in a way. The chorus is great on that song as well. Whipping Boy is a pretty great attempt at something a bit more power pop. Really energy and drive to that song, really good. An esoteric pick for one of my favourite Elton songs just to have fun with. I guess that's why they call it The Blues, not one of my absolute favourite singles of his, but it's part of his legacy most definitely. A nice sweeping 70s style romantic tune. I'm Still Standing, Kiss the Bride and Whipping Boy make for a pretty cool trio of rockers on this album. This might be one of his best attempts at staying cool and current on a later album, despite some solid moments after this album of course. I've read some people call this album overrated as one of his only 80s albums to get much critical notice, and that it's not much better than the albums surrounding it. I have to say to those people, how? How can you listen to the cool, icy synth pop of the title track or Crystal and not think it's better than the clunky as hell new wave rocker I Am Your Robot off Jump Up, or the awkward attempt at Caribbean pop at Passengers on the album after this? Are you deaf? To be fair, I'm not a huge fan of the last 2 tracks on this album. I think it runs out of steam just a little bit at the end there, but overall I don't think this album's overrated. I think it still deserves to be classed as one of his best. Coming up next I have Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player, still at 4 stars. Daniel doesn't sound like very much of a hit single to me considering that it was, but it's a suitable album opener. It's kind of easy to take it for granted now, but it's kind of cool to hear an electric piano take lead at that point of his career instead of an acoustic one, especially after the albums following Empty Sky. Teacher I Need You on track 2 is much more fun than anything he'd recorded to date. So with the unabashed sentimentality of Daniel and the more fun factor of Teacher I Need You, I feel like he'd started to get into the gear that I kind of wanted from him, a little bit more unafraid to be more sappy but also more outwardly fun as well, kind of expand his mood range a little bit and not be so stuck in a safe middle gear. A lot of the songs could have fit on his prior work, but they also sound very different from each other, offering a very varied music listening experience. Texan Love Song and Crocodile Rock appear to be his first songs with a bit of a comedic element to them, and for me both work very well. I don't think Crocodile Rock was necessarily intended that way, but I do think it has a little bit of that comedic element to it. In a way it's kind of a corny song, but it's also very unskippable. Have Mercy on the Criminal, despite its very theatrical mood and performance, does have some of Bernie's most effective early lyrics, I think. That's another big thing about this album. The lyrics on here are a lot more mainstream and easy in their presentation. Good News Remains on here for those who preferred his previous few albums. High Flying Bird and Blues for Baby and Me offer something still a little bit more like that. Coming in at number 2, I have Rock of the Westies, up to 4.5 stars for this one. Mostly forgotten, I feel like this album is. I love the funk rock groove of the opening track, really cool, kind of a headbanger. Right away you can tell he's getting away from the kind of cinematic or high concept feel of some of his past albums and getting onto something a little bit more fun. At this point he's kind of alternating between the 2 modes. The opener is honestly kind of a heck of an opener. There's a small sense of quirkiness to it, but also a lot of punch and fun that kind of carries towards the whole opening stretch of the album. As a more explicitly rock album, this starts out very convincingly. What's also cool is that Dan Dare has some kind of window dressing elements of futuristicness, while Caribbean Girl incorporates a few Caribbean motifs in it as well. So there's kind of thought and experimentation and hints going into it as well, not just pure fun. I feel like A Bullet is a really good first ballad for the album. Basically, the first half of this album in general just can't miss. Vocally, it's not like his voice has changed much from previous albums tonally, but he's singing with a lot more aggression on this album, kind of befitting the album's sound, showing a lot of good versatility in that way. Man, the chorus backing vocals on Hard Luck Story, I love them. The second half isn't quite as good for me, but almost so. Overall, I just found this album really fantastic on a much overdue re-listen of it. A thoroughly convincing attempt at an explicitly rock album. Very much fun rock with a slight quirkiness to it rather than tough posturing or anything, but still a really good consistent sound, a lot of punch. If Elton's typical kind of thing doesn't always grab you and you haven't heard this album, definitely check it out. Alright, coming in at number 1, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, up to 5 stars for this one. Hearing Funeral for a Friend for the first time back then must have been kind of a mind-blowing experience. It definitely built up the anticipation that this would be kind of a grand-scale album project, and the album ended up delivering. After the modest opening of Daniel from the previous album, it's kind of a shockwave. I don't think it has quite as memorable a keys or piano part as Daniel, but the whole thing just sounds grand, of course. Candle in the Wind, it's very theatrical performance of mourning, of course, but man, how do I always forget how good that song is? It kind of illustrates what I mean when I say I don't think Elton's ability to create singularly memorable piano parts was always there from the very beginning. There are several early albums where I remember the songs but not specific piano parts. Candle in the Wind, Benny and the Jets, the title track, you're not going to hear them and mistake the piano parts in them for any other song. Piano memorability is at kind of an all-time high for him on this album, I feel. All 3 songs are really overplayed, but that's beside the point. More than his other albums, I really hear hints of a sweeping pop, symphonic, classical kind of overtone to this album, just the very sweeping nature to most of the songs. I see why Jamaica Jerk would be considered the first weak song on the album for some people, but in full sequence I kind of get it. It kind of breaks up a bunch of more dramatic songs before it with something a little bit more lighthearted. Even if around Danny Bailey and Dirty Little Girl the album starts to drag just a little bit, I feel like they're good enough songs in their own right still, and with an album this long you kind of have to quote unquote forgive a couple of the songs anyway, meaning songs that are just very good as opposed to songs around it which are perfect a lot of the time. Your Sister Can't Twist should be more famous, to be honest. It's played very tightly but still very rock and roll styled, but also kind of has a druggy haze kind of. Really unique backing vocals as well. I've heard Elton talk a little bit flippantly about his earlier work, saying he kind of wrote all the songs in 5 minutes. I'm paraphrasing. I don't really know if he's telling the truth, of course, but I think sometimes he's underselling a little bit. For me, it's quite obvious with this one that they kind of set out to make a statement at minimum. Maybe small parts of the songs were written pretty quickly, but the overall arrangement stuff on top of the songs, they were meticulous. His most memorable songs and vocal and piano melodies on here, a very cool feel of diversity yet cohesion, and a really grand scale to the whole project, yet at times also a very everyman charm to the album. It's really hard not to call this his best, as basic as that opinion may be. Thanks guys, that was all 31 Elton solo albums ranked from worst to best. Hadn't really heard his 90s work until I did this deep dive, and I didn't feel like I was missing much after I did play them. But no, at some point this had to happen. I had to do this discography, because I knew so much of it already and he's so iconic. Thanks for watching guys, I'll see you next time.